In the front of my book that's coming out in December, I have a quote from Mary Oliver. It captures the act of poetry as a practice, but it is also an apt description of any spiritual practice. It reads simply, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." Paying attention is the beginning of devotion. Now, devotion is a kind of an old-fashioned word that we don't hear much anymore in casual conversation. It can be a prayer, and it can also mean deep affection and loyalty to someone or something. And either way, it implies a kind of dedication or relationship that is special, sometimes even sacred. And here is the telling thing, to me anyway, about the relationship between attention and devotion. If I bother to pay attention to something, focusing on whatever it is that is before me or within me or around me, it almost always leads to awe or amazement or gratitude. Now, with that in mind, I decided to pay attention to sparrows. So I Googled sparrow in hopes that it might lead me into today's sermon, since both Psalm 84 and Mary Oliver's poem kind of gather around this little bird on the way to maybe a bigger punchline. But anyway, the first thing that I came upon in my browser was a Krista Tippett interview, not about sparrows, with the wonderful English-Irish poet and also marine zoologist, David White. I think that's his right category of science. But he said in that interview that he was led back to poetry from science when he was living and studying in the Galapagos Islands. He realized that science, quite rightly he says, is always trying to remove the I from whatever it studies. But he realized that the more he paid attention to the I, what was taking place inside himself as he experienced the world around him, the more he deepened. The more he paid attention, he realized, the more his own I or self deepened. And that caught my attention because it is what Mary Oliver has showed me over and over and over again. Anyway, sparrows. You may know this already, but sparrows keep the company of larger flocks during mating season. Safety in numbers. And because they so often seem to swarm human habitats, looking for easy pickings, they came to represent community, connection, even love. In ancient Greece, the sparrow was Aphrodite's sacred bird. In Egypt, sparrows would catch the human soul at death and carry it into the afterlife. And there was a similar belief in old Europe, so that the sparrow was a popular tattoo of sailors who hoped that the bird tattooed on their arm or somewhere else would escort their souls to heaven should they die at sea. Now, we know that in the Bible, sparrows came to represent God's care for even the smallest of creatures. And in Psalm 84, the image of making its nest next to God evokes safety and security. But in the courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem, in Jesus' day, they were not greatly valued. They were the very cheapest live animal a poor person could purchase to have sacrificed on the altar. My mom considered sparrows a nuisance bird because, as a bird watcher with a life list, she wanted rarer and more exotic birds eating at her feeders. The sparrows just got in the way. Little, loud birds with big songs that open up in late winter when most other birds aren't singing yet. They have scores of different cousins within the same species, many of whom winter in the south and fly all the way to the top of the Arctic Circle to nest in the summer. For Mary Oliver, that striped sparrow was some kind of comfort, a companion in the otherwise empty pew of an afternoon field. They could not tame me, so they would not keep me. Mary Oliver writes about a hard and painful church experience. Alas, she wrote, and how that feels, the weight of it. I will not tell you, any of you, not ever. But the wordless hymn on the lips of the striped sparrow is so sweet that she isn't lonely. In spite of that horrible church experience that stole the words of the hymns from her memory, as they promised, she wrote, God, once in your heart, is everywhere. So even here, among the weeds and the brisk trees. What a great poem. Indeed, attention is the beginning of devotion, and paying attention to the small things, as small and even smaller than a sparrow, will teach our thoughts to go deeper and deepen the gratitude in our hearts for this God that is everywhere. Now, as I mentioned last week, that cannibal language from John about eat my flesh and drink my blood was John trash-talking his enemies who had kicked him and his compatriots out of the synagogue. We would have heard it again this week in the gospel, but I cut that first line from the gospel because I couldn't take a fourth week of it in a row. I don't know what's wrong with the lectionary. It is worth noting, however, that John reports that because of Jesus saying what he did about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, quote, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. It was a bridge too far. From the very earliest days of the Christian movement, centuries before it was actually a church and a religion called Christianity, people were in conflict with one another. Some cast out, some leaving in anger or disgust. It's a bitter irony that John's gospel is the one that speaks so much of love, and of God being love, and of our being of God when we host that love. And yet we so often act instead like bickering sparrows pecking furiously and jealously for that love as if it is scarce and not abundant. There's not one of us, including and maybe especially myself, within this community of faith, I don't know about yours, that hasn't at some point acted with anxiety within the community, as if there wasn't enough of something: love, resources, recognition, affirmation, money, compassion, sisterhood or brotherhood, even hope. And yet all that and more is right here now, if we pay attention and see it, know it, feel it, own it, receive it. For some reason, it is who we are and how we act sometimes, like sparrows. Frequently, in a place like this, there is redemption for our anxiety-driven ways. It's not like out there in the traffic, in the marketplace, and the other dog-eat-dog fields of dreams. But sometimes, in a place like this, we chase away our Mary Olivers, who get deeply wounded, or something we say or do, sometimes even without knowing it, offends them, hurts them. How heavy I feel when reading that line from her poem, I hum the hymns I used to sing in church. They could not tame me, so they would not keep me, alas, and how that feels, the weight of it. I have seen so many people leave church communities, hurt, disappointed, angry, lonely, grieved, and there seemed no bringing them back. And often it was a mystery to me how and why it happened, even though I could see and watch it, sometimes even predict it, sometimes knowing it was something to do with me. I think what we don't realize, and that our tradition has not been good at teaching and nurturing, is that community itself is a spiritual practice. Like writing poetry, like singing together, or doing church, being in and hanging with and working toward community, is itself an element of Christian spiritual practice. Family is tough enough to manage, and those blood and legal relationships have cords and hooks that bind. Community, spiritual community, doesn't have any of that sinew to keep it together. Only love. And here's the strange secret to the love of spiritual community that's most binding. It is the practice of being loved. We know how hard it is to love ourselves, really hard for some of us. Well, to go along with that challenge, a kind of extension of loving ourselves is being loved. Accepting, receiving, willingly grasping the love of others for ourselves. It's easy for me, perhaps it is for you too, to look around the worship space where you are part of community and feel the love of this particular bunch of yahoos you're with. But to consciously stop and recognize and accept and feel their love for you, that's a bit harder. The spiritual practice of community has secret and hidden and often surprising gifts that bloom and open to us when least expected. Loving and being loved by people to whom we can know that we have no blood or legal relationship is a practice that builds spiritual capacity and strength. But it's a practice, and it takes practice. As we read in John, whether or not it actually happened the way he said it did, Jesus' community had more than one falling out along the way. And certainly from the beginning, we have a pretty shaky track record when it comes to creating safe, open, and radically loving communities. Sparrows. I spent some time watching them attack the feeders at our house. They are amazing, all the ways that they can reach in and hang from and drop down and peck the seeds that nurture them. They're really good at getting what they need and staying connected with the flock while they're doing it. So, not a bad icon for us in community. Peace be with you, and thank you for being part of this community.